January 17th, 1945, Eastern France. Snow clung to the ruined village like a dirty shroud. Smoke curled from shattered chimneys, and the gutted hulks of tanks still smoldered under a pewter sky. Hauptmann Erich Krause stood beside his immobilized Tiger Fern, binoculars pressed against his frozen face, watching an American Sherman engulfed in flame. He had hit it clean, 2 direct shots from 88mm high-velocity rounds. The turret had popped, and flames danced from the crew hatch. To Krause, it was over. Another Tommy Cooker turned to scrap. But then the impossible happened. A figure crawled out, charred uniform torn, face blackened by soot. Then another, and another. 4 men, coughing and stumbling, dropped into the snow and ran for cover. They were alive. Krause lowered his binoculars, his fingers trembling, not from cold, but from something colder. Across the field, a second Tiger had taken a hit from a Thunderbolt's bomb minutes earlier. No one came out. No cries, no motion. Just scorched steel and silence. The irony struck hard. He had the better machine. They had the better chance of living. And that moment, quiet and smothered in smoke, was when he understood. Brute strength alone wouldn't win this war. The M4 Sherman was never meant to be the best tank in the world. It was meant to be good enough, and it was meant to be everywhere. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it brought with it not just manpower and resolve, but an industrial machine unlike anything the world had seen. America's factories were already capable of producing automobiles by the millions. Retooling them for war meant creating weapons on a scale that would dwarf Germany's handcrafted machines. The Sherman emerged from this philosophy. Designed in 1941 and entering production in 1942, it was fast to build, easy to maintain, and versatile enough to be adapted for countless roles. Tank, flamethrower platform, bridge layer, recovery vehicle, and more. By war's end, over 49,000 M4 Shermans had been built. An astonishing number, compared to fewer than 1/400 Tiger WWII tanks and around 6,000 Panthers. In North Africa, the Sherman made its debut against German armor during Operation Torch and the subsequent campaigns in Tunisia. At first, its performance surprised even its critics. Against early war Panzers, it was effective. But when the first Tigers arrived, and later Panthers, the equation shifted. Shermans had to close distance to penetrate thick frontal armor, often exposing themselves to devastating fire. Still, the Americans didn't flinch. Instead of redesigning the tank from scratch or attempting to match the Germans shot for shot, they improved the Sherman incrementally, upgrading its gun to the 76mm variant, improving its wet storage to reduce fires, and, most critically, refining its role in the broader U.S. war doctrine. The Sherman wasn't a duelist. It was a team player. By 1944, Shermans were moving into Normandy by the thousands, disembarking from LSTs onto Utah and Omaha beaches, forming the armored fist of Patton's Third Army. But they didn't operate alone. The Americans used overwhelming combined arms, artillery barrages, air support from P-47 Thunderbolts, infantry coordination, and massed armor thrusts. A single Sherman might not take down a Tiger, but 3 Shermans, backed by artillery and ground spotters, often could. And more importantly, while German tanks were irreplaceable, Shermans could be replaced by the dozen. The Germans laughed at the Sherman's silhouette. It was tall, it was boxy, and when hit, it sometimes exploded with a gut-wrenching roar. But that boxy design allowed for better crew ergonomics, easier visibility, and faster evacuation. American tank crews had higher survival rates not because of armor, but because of engineering that gave them a chance to get out when everything went wrong. And that mattered, more than German engineers ever admitted. As the Allies pushed through France, toward the Siegfried Line and into the heart of Nazi Germany, the Sherman became not just a machine, but a symbol. A blunt force of relentless pressure. A tank that burned, yes, but kept coming. And for every German commander who mocked it, the question was no longer, can we kill it? It was, can we stop enough of them in time? The Sherman had a reputation, one that spread fast across German tank crews, Allied infantry, and the civilians caught in between. It wasn't feared in the way the Tiger or Panther was, but it was respected for something far more subtle. It kept moving, and its crews kept surviving. Technologically, the M4 wasn't revolutionary. Its armor was modest by late war standards. Front hull armor averaged around 51 mm, with later models reaching 76 mm. Its original 75 mm gun was inadequate against the front plates of Tigers and Panthers. Even with the upgraded 76 mm and high-velocity ammunition, penetrating the thick frontal armor of German heavy tanks was a gamble. But this design wasn't an oversight. It was a compromise. Instead of stacking armor and firepower that would weigh the vehicle down, the Americans built the Sherman around mobility, versatility, and, critically, reliability. It could go farther on less fuel. It started in cold weather. It required less maintenance and fewer tools to keep operational. For every one German Panther on the battlefield, there were usually 5 Shermans. And when the terrain turned ugly, mud, snow, or the cratered hellscape of a shelled village, the Sherman's lighter. Frame and robust suspension let it go where heavier. Machines bogged down, but what truly separated the Sherman from its German counterparts was its survivability, not just of the tank, but of the men inside. Early in the war, the Sherman's internal ammunition storage was poorly protected. When hit, it often cooked off, rounds igniting in a chain reaction that blew the turret skyward and reduced the interior to a furnace. The nickname Ronson, after the lighter that lights every time, was grimly earned. American engineers took notice. By mid-1944, new models included wet stowage, surrounding ammunition racks with protective water jackets that drastically reduced internal fires. Studies showed that tanks with wet stowage were nearly 80% less likely to burn when penetrated. Escape hatches were enlarged. Turret space allowed for better crew movement. And radios, standard in every Sherman, meant that crews could coordinate, call in support, or warn others before disaster struck. This had psychological consequences. German tankers, sitting inside behemoths like the Tiger, knew they were in steel coffins. If the tank was hit and burned, escape was rare. The Tiger's internal layout was cramped and complex, its hatches fewer, and its design prioritized firepower over crew ergonomics. Panthers, too, suffered from mechanical failures and vulnerability from the sides and rear. A well-placed 76 mm round to a Panther's flank often meant total loss, and, for the crew, very little chance to survive. The difference wasn't lost on the battlefield. While the Tiger's 18 mm gun might obliterate a Sherman from 1,500 meters, if the American crew managed to bail out, they could be recrewed into another tank within days. The German crew, on the other hand, was often buried with their machine. For the Allies, the goal was always to bring men back to fight another day. For the Germans, increasingly short on trained crews and resources, every destroyed tank was a deeper wound. This became especially clear in the heart of France, where Shermans rolled in endless columns, supported by artillery and air cover. German officers watched their prized tanks burn, not for lack of skill or bravery, but because they couldn't match the tide. Some commanders began to notice. They no longer mocked the Sherman's thin skin or high silhouette. They began to respect something more elemental, its ability to keep fighting, to get repaired quickly, and to give its crews a better shot at seeing tomorrow. And slowly, the laughter began to fade. German commanders were not blind to changing battlefield dynamics. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the myth of armored invincibility began to erode. Panther units were often understrength, Tigers were deployed sparingly, and every destroyed vehicle was a strategic blow. Still, many clung to a sense of superiority until they encountered a different kind of challenge, the adaptability of the Sherman, and the system that supported it. German officers often wrote reports on the mechanical failures of their own vehicles. Panthers had a tendency to throw tracks or suffer engine fires, especially during long road marches. Tigers were notorious for requiring heavy recovery equipment when immobilized, and such equipment was often unavailable. On the other hand, American units had mobile repair teams, spare parts transported with the advancing lines, and recovery vehicles ready to tow damaged Shermans back for rapid turnaround. What took days or weeks for German units often took hours for the Americans. This logistical advantage wasn't just about maintenance, it was about morale. When a German tank was damaged, the crew often knew it was gone for good. For American crews, a disabled Sherman wasn't the end. Many returned to action the same week. This had a compounding effect. German officers grew more cautious. Attacks were delayed waiting on repairs. Tanks were held back to preserve them for a more decisive moment. Meanwhile, Shermans flooded the field, seemingly endless in supply. The German mindset, once aggressive and confident, began to fracture. Then there was the emotional weight of watching an enemy crew walk away. It struck deep. In battle, the outcome was often seconds long. A flash, a hit, and a fire. Seeing a tank burn was confirmation of a kill. But when Sherman crews began emerging from fire-wreathed vehicles, coughing and bloody but alive, German tankers felt something strange. Not relief, not respect, jealousy. They sat inside the best machines German engineering could build. But if they were hit, they died inside them. Their machines were their tombs. The Americans were driving machines that let them out. It didn't make the Sherman better in combat, but it made it more human. It gave its crews hope. And in war, hope is as potent as armor. Even in captured documents and interrogations, German officers began to mention this. Some admitted they no longer underestimated the Sherman. Others conceded its tactical utility, even if they still criticized its design. One captured officer from a Panther unit said bluntly, "They burn, but their crews live. We don't. The war was shifting. Technology mattered, but survivability mattered more." The Americans weren't trying to win by building the best tank. They were trying to win by building one that would bring its crew home. And in the end, for the men inside, that was what counted most. By August 1944, the German war machine in France was unraveling. After the D-Day landings and the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces surged toward the interior. German units, staggered and reeling, tried to regroup in the narrow valleys and dense hedgerows of the Falaise region. What followed would become one of the most decisive and brutal armored engagements of the Western Front. The encirclement at the Falaise pocket. German divisions, Panzer, infantry, SS, became trapped as the Americans closed in from the south and the Canadians from the north. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and his officers pleaded for a retreat. Hitler refused, ordering the stand to continue. Inside the pocket, over 50,000 German troops, along with hundreds of tanks and vehicles, were compressed into a killing ground no more than a few miles wide. The Americans brought everything they had: artillery, air power, infantry, and tanks, hundreds of Shermans. To the German tank commanders, it was a nightmare. Visibility was poor. Roads were jammed. Air attacks by P-47 Thunderbolts strafed and bombed every daylight movement. And across the fields, the Shermans advanced, not in elegant dueling lines or armored wedges, but in waves, dozens at a time, supported by infantry and fire direction from spotter planes circling overhead. Tigers tried to hold crossroads. Panthers lined hedgerows. Their gunners took out Shermans at 1,000 meters, sometimes more. But every time a Sherman was destroyed, another moved forward. Then another, and another, crews inside Tigers began to panic. Not because the Sherman was better, but because there were simply too many of them. And when their tanks were hit, there was no time to escape. Inside the Tiger's thick hull, spalling, fragments of armor breaking off inside tore through the crew. Ammunition ignited. Hatches jammed. The tank became a furnace. Meanwhile, across the field, another Sherman took a hit. The turret was blown open. Smoke belched out, and yet, moments later, the crew was seen running, 2 men dragging a wounded comrade, another limping behind them. Bloodied, but alive. One German gunner, watching through a periscope, reportedly muttered, "Why do they live and we don't?" The answer wasn't armor thickness, it was design. American engineers had built the Sherman with escape in mind. Crew hatches were larger. The internal layout allowed for quicker movement. Ammunition was stored below the turret ring, shielded and water-jacketed. The ventilation system, designed for the Pacific Theater's heat, helped suppress fires. The German tanks were fortresses, but when breached, they were death traps. During the final days of the Falaise Pocket, German commanders began ordering retreats without waiting for confirmation from Berlin. Discipline cracked. Entire tank crews abandoned their vehicles, knowing they couldn't get them out through the destroyed roads and Allied bombing runs. The Shermans rolled forward. In one sector, a German Panther knocked out 4 Shermans before being flanked and destroyed by a 5th. In another, a Sherman platoon crossed a river under fire, losing 2 tanks, but still reached their objective. At the end of the battle, over 300 German tanks lay in ruins. The Allies lost many Shermans, but they kept pushing. Falaise wasn't a victory of better tanks. It was a victory of relentless force, coordinated movement, and survival-driven design. And for the German commanders watching their elite armor burn, it was the beginning of a bitter realization. The Sherman wasn't supposed to win, but somehow it was. 1 month after the carnage at Falaise, German armor was once again thrown into a desperate attempt to blunt the Allied advance. This time in the open farmlands of Lorraine, near the small town of Aricourt. It was September 1944. The German 5th Panzer Army launched a counteroffensive, deploying over 200 armored vehicles, many of them Panthers, in an effort to retake ground lost to General Patton's Third Army. Their objective: strike swiftly, exploit the fog and poor weather, and catch American tank units off guard. What they encountered instead was one of the most surprising tank battles of the war. Aricourt was defended primarily by the 4th Armored Division, composed largely of Sherman tanks and tank destroyers. On paper, the odds favored the Germans. The Panther's gun outranged anything the Shermans carried. Its frontal armor was nearly impenetrable, but the battle would not unfold on paper. Thick morning fog blanketed the region, reducing visibility to less than 100 meters in some areas. German tank commanders, unfamiliar with the terrain and lacking air reconnaissance, pushed forward blindly. Their tight formations made them easy targets for ambushes. American tankers, many veterans of the Normandy hedgerows, knew how to fight blind. They used the terrain, small ridges, barns, tree lines, to maneuver rapidly and strike from flanks. In one encounter, a single Sherman platoon ambushed a column of Panthers emerging from a fog bank. While the lead Panther tried to rotate its massive turret, the Shermans fired into its sides and rear. 2 Panthers were destroyed before they returned fire. The Shermans then relocated, vanishing back into the mist. This pattern repeated across the battlefield. Sherman units struck, repositioned, and struck again. Artillery observers perched in haylofts called in precise barrages. American radio coordination allowed tank commanders to adjust instantly. German radio nets were cluttered or silent. Without air cover and struggling with fuel shortages, German advances slowed, then stalled. In some cases, Panthers fired first, but missed. The fog distorted distances. Shells went wide or struck low. Meanwhile, the Sherman's faster turret traverse allowed them to fire first at close range. Even if their rounds didn't penetrate frontally, they targeted weak spots, tracks, turret rings, engine compartments, and the difference in design was once again laid bare. When Panthers were hit, escape was difficult. Flames often spread fast through the engine compartment. In one account, 3 of 5 crew members in a burning Panther perished before the hatches could be opened. In contrast, American tankers, even from burning Shermans, often bailed out and re-entered battle the same day in another vehicle. By the end of the Battle of Aracourt, the Germans had lost over 100 tanks, many of them Panthers. The Americans lost around 25 Shermans. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological one. German commanders had entered the fight, assuming technological dominance would carry the day. But technology didn't account for weather, terrain, radio communication, crew training, or survivability. The Panther's gun couldn't fire through fog. Its armor couldn't stop an artillery barrage. And its crew couldn't escape a burning hull once the hatch jammed. The Sherman, by contrast, wasn't beautiful. It wasn't terrifying. It wasn't elegant. But it was enough. It was enough to kill. Enough to move. Enough to bring the crew home. And on the wide plains of Lorraine, for the second time in as many months, German tank commanders began to ask questions their doctrines had never prepared them to answer. By the close of 1944, the myth of German armored invincibility was in ruins. The twin blows at Falaise and Aracourt had done more than destroy tanks. They had shattered illusions. The Wehrmacht's once prized armored divisions were bleeding out, not just from Allied firepower, but from attrition they could no longer sustain. Each Tiger lost was irreplaceable. Each Panther that broke down on the road to battle was a missed opportunity, a hole in the line. Meanwhile, American columns, dominated by Shermans, continued rolling eastward. The numbers told the story plainly. By war's end, the Germans had produced fewer than 1,400 Tiger Thorn tanks and around 6,000 Panthers. In contrast, the United States built over 49,000 Shermans, and that didn't include specialized variants, those equipped with flamethrowers, mine flails, rocket launchers, and amphibious kits. For every German tank destroyed, several Shermans filled the void, but the real shift came not in the factories, but on the battlefield. German tankers who once dismissed the Sherman as a mobile coffin began to change their tone. Intelligence reports intercepted by Allied units revealed an increasing respect, if reluctant, for the way Shermans operated as part of a larger system. They weren't just tanks. They were instruments in a larger symphony of artillery, air power, and rapid mobility. In interviews after the war, German officers reflected on the changing tide. Some acknowledged that, while their machines were superior in isolation, they were never designed for the kind of sustained warfare that America was waging. Others admitted envy, not of the Sherman's gun or armor, but of the crew's ability to survive a direct hit, to crawl out, dazed and burned, but breathing. Survivability had replaced supremacy. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself, unable to challenge the P-47s that prowled the skies. German supply lines were strangled, fuel was scarce, and maintenance crews were overwhelmed. A Tiger abandoned because it had thrown a track was often just left behind, its crew reassigned or dead. By late 1944, many of Germany's most elite tankers were gone, killed, captured, or simply worn out. The Sherman wasn't just outlasting the Germans, it was outmaneuvering them strategically. It could be shipped across oceans, offloaded in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, or the Pacific. It could climb muddy hills in Italy or navigate the frozen forests of the Ardennes. It could be repaired in a field garage or cannibalized to patch 5 more. Its crew could learn it in weeks, fight in it for months, and, if lucky, survive to climb into another. And with every passing day, the grim nicknames lost their sting. Tommy Cooker had once been a joke. Now it was a lie. Because while many Shermans did burn, their crews walked away far more often than those inside Germany's finest tanks. The war continued to grind forward, each mile bringing Allied forces closer to the heart of Germany. As towns fell and bridges were taken, the Sherman became a familiar sight, not just to Allied infantry, but to the German civilians and prisoners of war who watched them roll by in endless columns. Captured German officers, when debriefed, often expressed bewilderment, not at the performance of the Sherman in direct tank combat, but at how it continued to appear everywhere, in numbers that defied logic. One officer remarked, "They fall from the sky. We destroy 5 and face 10 more by morning." Another observed that the real danger wasn't the tank itself. It was what came with it. The artillery that bracketed German positions, the air support that followed, the infantry riding on its hulls, and the engineers clearing mines behind them. For some German veterans, the Sherman came to represent inevitability, not dominance, but relentless progress, a machine that reflected the character of the American war effort, pragmatic, industrial, unyielding. But there was also a growing respect, muted, often unspoken, for its design philosophy. Not because it was fearsome, but because it understood what war actually was. American designers had not built the Sherman to impress. They built it to endure, to give its crew a chance, to operate in mud and snow, to be fixed with a wrench and return to battle before sundown. In contrast, many German tanks were over-engineered. The Tiger required meticulous care. The Panther needed constant maintenance. Crews had to be highly trained. Spares were rare. Recovery was difficult. What began as technological superiority had become a logistical liability. By 1945, it was clear. The Sherman had outlived the machines that were supposed to destroy it. And in the end, it wasn't just about armor or firepower, it was about what the tank represented. The Sherman stood for survivability, adaptability, and above all, continuity. When a Tiger burned, the war effort lost 5 elite soldiers and an irreplaceable vehicle. When a Sherman burned, more often than not, its crew climbed into another one by the end of the week. The war's final months were filled with bitter reversals for the German military. Entire Panzer units surrendered intact, out of fuel and options. Shermans crossed the Rhine on hastily built pontoon bridges. Town after town fell, not to mythical supertanks, but to a machine once mocked for its weaknesses. In the end, it survived the jokes. It survived the 88mm shells. It survived the war. The Tiger may have ruled the duels, but the Sherman won the campaign. It's easy to admire the Tiger and the Panther. Their silhouettes, their armor, their power. They embodied the brutal elegance of German engineering. They left scars on the battlefield, wrecked columns, and haunted the memories of tank crews long after the war. But they also carried something else, finality. When they burned, their crews rarely walked away. The Sherman was different. It didn't win duels. It didn't inspire fear. It was mocked, scorned, even pitied. But it kept going, not because it was indestructible, but because it was designed with one quiet, humble purpose, to bring its crew back alive. It was the tank of the soldier, not the showpiece of the general. It stood not for dominance, but for perseverance, for practicality, for numbers that could not be ignored, and logistics that could not be broken. It was flawed, yes, but it adapted, it evolved, and it never stopped rolling forward. In the final accounting, that's what mattered: survival. While German commanders cursed their luck and watched their brilliant machines become burning tombs, the Sherman crews emerged from the smoke, limping, coughing, alive. And in war, sometimes, that's the only kind of victory that counts. The Sherman was never the best tank, but it was the right one, and it helped win the war.